December 1944. The dense Ardennes forest, cloaked in white and silence, is about to become the setting for Hitler's final gamble. It's the start of what will be known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. For the men of the 101st Airborne Division, stationed around the Belgian town of Bastogne, this is not the Christmas they expected. They are cut off, surrounded, and frozen in place by the relentless German counter-offensive. Supplies are dwindling, communication lines are fractured, and amid the confusion, a small detachment of men, later known as the Lost Battalion of Bastogne, receives one final order: to secure an eastern supply route through the forest. They never return. The unit in question belonged to the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne. Unlike the paratroopers, these were glider troops, soldiers who landed behind enemy lines in fragile wooden gliders, often under fire, bringing with them the heavier weapons and supplies needed to support airborne missions. In the frozen landscape east of Bastogne, their mission was to scout and hold a series of farm roads connecting the besieged town to the villages of Foy and Neffe, critical routes for any potential relief or retreat. At dawn on December 19th, Captain John S. McCulloch led roughly 40 men into the snow-covered woods east of the perimeter. They carried M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and enough rations for 2 days. A few of them, privates barely 20 years old, joked that they were heading into Christmas country, a quiet patch of trees where they hoped to find shelter from the artillery. But within hours, radio contact with McCulloch's group was lost. A scheduled check-in at 1300 hours never came. Patrols sent to re-establish contact found nothing but a trail of half-buried boot prints and a few broken branches, where it appeared the men had left the road. At first, headquarters assumed the team had simply taken cover from German shelling or repositioned due to enemy pressure. Reports were flooding in from every sector. The German 5th Panzer Army was advancing from the north, and Kampfgruppe Peiper's armoured spearhead was pushing west with terrifying speed. In the chaos of that week, one missing platoon seemed insignificant compared to the larger struggle for survival. But when the fighting intensified and McCulloch's men failed to reappear, questions began to surface. The conditions were brutal beyond imagination. The winter of '44 was one of the coldest on record in Europe. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Celsius. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed nearly as many men as enemy fire. Our breath froze on our faces, one survivor later recalled. Every step cracked the snow like breaking glass. The 101st dug foxholes in the frozen earth using their bayonets. Artillery fire shook the ground day and night. To venture out of Bastogne was to vanish into a white abyss of trees, where sound was muffled and direction meaningless. McCulloch's orders had come directly from regimental command. The eastern route was vital. German infiltration units were reported in the woods, disguised in American uniforms. Saboteurs from Otto Skorzeny Operation Greif, spreading confusion behind Allied lines. It was possible that McCulloch's detachment had stumbled upon one of these teams or been ambushed by roving enemy patrols. Yet no German reports from that sector ever mentioned a firefight. No bodies were found when the front shifted days later. A single, chilling note survives in the regimental logbook, written by a staff officer on December 21st. Patrol east of Foy, no contact. Presumed missing in action. Conditions extreme. After that, there are no further mentions of the men. Their names were quietly added to casualty lists as MIA, presumed captured or deceased. For the families back home, telegrams arrived weeks later, bearing the same sterile language: missing in action, Belgium. Few would ever learn the full story, or even the location where their loved ones vanished. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the siege tightened. German tanks surrounded the town, cutting off all roads. Food ran out. Ammunition was rationed bullet by bullet. The only lifeline came from the air. C-47s dropping supplies through the blizzard when the skies cleared. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous one-word reply to the German demand for surrender, "Nuts," became legend. But beneath that defiance lay a grim truth. Men were freezing and dying in their foxholes, and some, like McCulloch's detachment, simply disappeared. As the snow fell thicker, their absence was swallowed by the battle's chaos. Officially, they were just another wartime mystery, a patrol lost in the fog of war. Unofficially, whispers began to spread among the men who had fought in Bastogne. They spoke of hearing rifle shots echoing in the woods days after contact was lost. Some claimed to see flashes of movement between the trees, too far to identify, but too deliberate to ignore. The forest east of Bastogne had become a place of unanswered questions, a frozen labyrinth where direction, time, and reason seemed to dissolve. The war was not yet over, but for those men, the fight and the mystery had already slipped beyond the edge of the known. The next part of their story begins when the blizzards lift, and the first search parties set out to find what, if anything, remains of the soldiers who disappeared in the snow. By December 21st, 1944, the forests surrounding Bastogne had become a white wasteland. The snow was relentless, thick, blinding, and merciless. Temperatures plunged each night, coating weapons in frost and freezing rations solid. To the men of the 101st Airborne, the Ardennes was no longer just a battlefield. It was a graveyard waiting to claim the unprepared. Yet amid the siege, attention turned toward a troubling silence. The missing patrol from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, last seen heading east into the woods near Foy. 2 days after they vanished, a rescue attempt was authorized. A small search party from Company C was ordered to locate the men or confirm their fate. Led by Lieutenant Harold Red Summers, they followed the faint tracks that McCulloch's unit had left behind. Prints half buried in snow, leading deeper into the trees. Summers later described the forest as an endless white corridor, where visibility was measured in meters and every branch looked like the silhouette of a soldier. They advanced slowly, weapons raised, expecting at any moment to encounter German patrols. The sound of artillery thundered in the distance, Bastogne under siege. Occasionally, the forest would flash with orange light from distant explosions, illuminating the trees like ghosts in the fog. But as Summers's men reached the first tree line east of Foy, they found something unexpected. Scattered equipment, rations, ammo belts, a broken M1 rifle, and a glider infantry patch torn from a jacket. No signs of a struggle, no blood, just abandonment. A short distance beyond, they came upon the remains of a temporary position. Shallow foxholes dug into the snow, arranged in a defensive semicircle. It appeared as though the missing men had prepared to hold their ground. There were cartridge casings frozen into the drifts, Summers wrote in his post-war account. They'd been firing, but at what or whom we couldn't tell. He also noted that the firing direction faced not east, toward German lines, but west, back toward Bastogne. That single observation would trouble historians for decades. The search party continued deeper into the woods, but soon lost the trail entirely. Heavy snowfall erased all evidence of movement. As night fell, temperatures dropped to 25 degrees. The men's boots froze stiff. Their breath came out in clouds. Realizing they were at risk of exposure themselves, Summers ordered a withdrawal before darkness could consume them. They returned to Bastogne, empty-handed, carrying only fragments of the missing platoon's gear. At regimental headquarters, the report was brief and inconclusive. The official record for December 22nd reads, "Recon east of Foy. Found signs of brief engagement. No enemy presence confirmed. No friendly casualties located." The absence of bodies puzzled everyone. In most engagements during the Bulge, combat left unmistakable traces: shell holes, casualties, shell casings, footprints leading to retreat or pursuit. But here, the forest seemed to have erased everything. Some officers speculated that McCulloch's men had been captured by infiltrating German forces. It was not impossible. Operation Greif had deployed English-speaking commandos disguised as US troops to sow confusion. However, no German records after the war indicated any such capture. Prisoner interrogations and Wehrmacht logs made no mention of an American platoon taken alive in that sector. Others offered a more practical explanation. The patrol might have been cut off, disoriented, and succumbed to exposure while trying to find their way back through the snowstorm. The Ardennes was unforgiving. A man could lose his bearings within minutes. But again, the absence of remains made that theory difficult to confirm. When the snow thawed months later, no bodies were recovered in the vicinity. Private Edward Barnes, one of the few soldiers who volunteered for repeated search efforts, recalled a haunting detail. "You could hear things out there," he said in an interview decades later. "Cracking branches, sometimes the echo of gunfire that wasn't ours. We figured it was the Krauts moving around, but sometimes it came from where no Germans were supposed to be." The longer the siege continued, the less attention the missing platoon received. Bastogne itself was hanging by a thread. German armor surrounded the town. Supplies had to be airdropped through narrow breaks in the clouds. Medical units ran out of morphine and bandages. Men survived on frozen K-rations and melted snow. Each day without word from McCulloch's men felt less like suspense and more like certainty. They were gone. Yet there was something unsettling about the entire episode. Every soldier who passed through those eastern woods described a peculiar stillness, a dead zone of silence where even birds refused to perch. Many felt watched. Some claimed to see boot tracks leading nowhere, ending abruptly in unbroken snow. For the commanders of the 101st, these were distractions, morale-threatening rumors in the middle of a desperate defense. The war left no time for mysteries, but the questions remained, buried under the snow like the men themselves. Why had they fired west? Why had they dug in as if expecting an attack from their own lines? And how could an entire platoon vanish without a trace in the middle of one of the most documented battles of the war? As the siege dragged into Christmas, Bastogne became a symbol of defiance and survival. But for the families of the missing glider infantrymen, hope was already fading. Official word came on December 26th, presumed missing in action. No one knew it then, but the relief of Bastogne by Patton's Third Army would only deepen the mystery. Because when the snow began to melt, the forest would tell a different story. The next part begins with liberation and the strange discoveries left behind when the guns finally fell silent. December 26, 1944, the siege of Bastogne is finally broken. After a week of relentless shelling, dwindling rations, and bitter cold, General George S. Patton's Third Army pushes through the German lines and relieves the exhausted defenders of the 101st Airborne Division. The men are gaunt, frostbitten, and hollow-eyed, but unbroken. The town of Bastogne has become a symbol of American endurance. The battered bastards of the Bastion of Bastogne, as they would come to be called. Yet, amid the cheers and tears of relief, a quieter question lingers among the ranks. What became of the missing patrol east of Foy? As the weather clears and units begin to reorganize, scattered accounts begin to surface. Soldiers from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment report seeing figures moving through the forests beyond the perimeter. Groups of men in American uniforms, traveling silently between the trees. "We thought it was one of our own patrols," wrote Private Robert Fleming in his diary, dated December 27th. "They moved fast, quiet. When we tried to signal them, they didn't respond, just kept walking north, like ghosts in the fog." Similar stories spread among the troops. A supply convoy claimed they were hailed by men waving American-issue helmets near the village of Warden, only for the figures to vanish when approached. Local Belgian civilians, emerging cautiously from their cellars, told of hearing English voices calling commands in the forest long after the siege had ended. But no such patrols were recorded in Allied movement logs. Every accounted-for company was either within Bastogne or advancing with Patton's columns. Whoever those soldiers were, if they existed at all, they weren't supposed to be there. By early January, as the front shifted eastward and the Allies began counterattacks, the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment received orders to consolidate positions. Only then did the command revisit the issue of the missing men. Captain McCulloch and his 40-man team were officially declared presumed killed in action. The entry appeared in the regimental morning report, a sterile line among thousands like it. Deck 19 to 21. Patrol missing east of Foy. No recovery. Presumed KIA, yet rumors persisted. In the makeshift mess halls and medical tents, soldiers swapped stories about the lost battalion. Some claimed they'd found ration tins and ammo boxes arranged in strange, deliberate patterns, as if marking a trail or signal. Others spoke of German prisoners, describing brief firefights in the woods, with small Allied squads weeks after Bastogne had been relieved. Units that seemed to appear and disappear overnight. The German officers dismissed these claims as confusion during retreat. Still, the parallels were impossible to ignore. Among the first official attempts to verify these accounts came from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, tasked with clearing mines and debris from the forest roads. In early January, one of their sergeants, Walter Hennessy, submitted a report noting signs of extended habitation in a sector east of Foy, collapsed snow shelters, remains of small fires, and shell casings consistent with M1 rifles. No human remains were found. The camp had been abandoned or evacuated, only days earlier. It was like they'd just stepped out, Hennessy wrote. Everything still in place, coffee tins half full, a deck of cards frozen to the ground. To the brass at division headquarters, the findings were inconclusive. They blamed scavengers or stragglers from other units. But for men like Hennessy, who had walked through those silent woods, the scene defied easy explanation. You can tell when a camp is overrun, he recalled. This one wasn't. They left on their own, in a hurry, but not in panic. In the years that followed, oral histories from Bastogne veterans continued to mention the disappearing platoon. Some dismissed it as post-battle folklore, a coping mechanism for men who had endured unimaginable hardship. Others swore they'd seen the evidence themselves. Sergeant George Lytle of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery claimed he heard a burst of M1 fire from the eastern woods 2 days after relief, long after the area had been cleared of Germans. It was unmistakable, he said. 7 rounds, then silence. Even local villagers seemed haunted by the mystery. Farmers who returned to their fields in the spring of 1945 reported finding boot prints in half-melted snow leading toward the woods. Dozens of them, all headed east. The snow was melting, said a resident of Foy decades later. But those prints, they looked new. By the time formal investigations began after the war, the trail had long gone cold. The US Graves Registration Service scoured the Bastogne area for remains throughout 1946 and 1947, recovering hundreds of fallen soldiers. But none matched the missing men of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Their names remained etched on lists of the missing, their fates marked only by absence. Historian Paul Stenner, in his 1963 study The Bastogne Enigma, summarized it this way. In a battle of chaos and cold, men vanished. The forest took them, and history forgot them. Whether they died, deserted, or wandered beyond recovery, we will never know. But something about the case refuses to rest. Too many witnesses, too much silence. Even now, the story sits uneasily in official archives, neither confirmed nor denied, a wartime riddle buried beneath snow and legend. In the words of one unnamed survivor from the 101st, we won the battle, but some part of that forest never let go of our dead. The next chapter begins in the aftermath of the war, when search teams return to Bastogne and uncover evidence that challenges every explanation offered so far. Spring 1945. The snow that had sealed Bastogne in silence finally begins to melt. With the front now pushing deep into Germany, military engineers and recovery teams are sent back into the Ardennes to clear the roads, recover abandoned equipment, and locate the missing. For most, this was the quiet, necessary work of closure, reclaiming the remnants of a battlefield frozen in time. But in the forests east of Bastogne, near Foy and Marvy, what they find only deepens the mystery of the vanished platoon. The 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion was among the first to return. Their orders were straightforward: locate mines, clear the main supply route, and mark any potential graves for the Graves Registration Service. Yet within days, the engineers begin reporting odd discoveries. We found foxholes, dozens of them, dug into a ridgeline facing west, recalled Corporal William J. Carter in a post-war letter. They were neat, professional, like something an infantry squad would build if expecting an attack. But that made no sense. The Germans were east of there. Carter's observation matched those from earlier patrols during the siege. The missing platoon's defensive positions appeared to have been turned the wrong way. The foxholes were shallow, hastily dug, their interiors lined with frozen pine branches for insulation. Shell casings were found embedded in the soil, 30 caliber, matching American-issued M1 rifles and bars. But the pattern of the fire suggested engagement from both sides. As one engineer put it, it looked like Americans shooting at Americans. Nearby, investigators discovered a cluster of personal items preserved by the cold. Field packs, canteens and letters from home, all labelled with names from Captain McCulloch's roster. There were no bodies, no helmets, no sign of a retreat. It was as if the men had packed up and marched deeper into the woods, leaving their perimeter intact. Sergeant Raymond Foy of the 326th wrote, "The whole area felt wrong. No birds, no sound. We left markers, but even our maps didn't match up right in those woods." The US Army's Graves Registration Service took over the search in late March. Their process was methodical, forensic. They charted every piece of equipment, photographed every clue. In the official report, filed April 3, 1945, the site was described as a temporary encampment, approximately 40 men, duration unknown. The report noted no evidence of burial, no enemy shell damage, no signs of combat casualties. A line at the bottom adds tersely, direction of withdrawal uncertain. It was an admission that the army, for all its precision, could not explain what had happened here. Among the more peculiar finds were the patterns of the remaining rations. C-ration cans were stacked in neat triangles, sometimes arranged beside cartridge belts or helmets. To some, it looked like a primitive signal system, perhaps an attempt to guide friendly forces. Others suggested the men had lost their bearings and were marking their path. But the formations continued erratically for several kilometers, leading northeast, toward an area marked on maps as Bois Jacques, the same forest that had witnessed some of the fiercest fighting of the siege. When the investigation reached Bois Jacques, the trail stopped abruptly. No further evidence of movement could be found. A few scattered objects, a torn glove, a rusted entrenching tool, lay at the base of the trees. But there was nothing to indicate a skirmish or a retreat. The woods themselves seemed to swallow the evidence. As Lieutenant Frank Meyer, who oversaw the search, later said, it was like chasing shadows through snowmelt. In the months that followed, the US Army quietly closed the file. With the war in Europe nearing its end, the focus shifted to victory and reconstruction. Hundreds of men were still unaccounted for in the Ardennes, missing, buried in unmarked graves, or never identified. The loss of one platoon was tragic, but not unique. Officially, the case was listed as unresolved. Unofficially, however, those who had been there couldn't forget what they'd seen. Back in the States, families began receiving letters from the War Department. Your son is missing in action. Efforts to recover his remains continue. Some, like Mrs. Margaret McCulloch, the captain's mother, wrote repeatedly to the Pentagon seeking answers. In one archived response, dated 1946, an Army liaison replied, "Search operations in the Bastogne area have yielded incomplete results. Terrain and conditions have rendered identification impossible." It was the final word most families ever received. Years later, when post-war recovery teams returned to remap the region, they continued to note the strange alignment of defensive positions. Every foxhole pointed west, one historian observed. It's as if the men expected the enemy to come from the very town they were sent to protect. The contradiction has fueled decades of speculation, confusion, miscommunication, even friendly fire incidents. But there are no records of any such engagement near the coordinates where they vanished. Today, visitors to the Bastogne woods can still find shallow depressions in the ground, remnants of those foxholes, softened by time and covered in moss. Local guides tell the story in hushed tones. The patrol that walked into the forest and never returned. No gunfire, no surrender, no graves. Just footprints leading into the trees and a question that history never answered. For some, that silence is explanation enough. The Ardennes in 1944 was chaos, maps unreliable, orders garbled, snow erasing all memory. But for others, soldiers, historians, and the few who searched those woods firsthand, the details remain too deliberate, too precise, to be mere confusion. Why dig in facing west? Why leave everything behind? And why, in a war so meticulously recorded, does not a single German or Allied log explain what happened in those woods? As peace settles over Europe, the mystery fades from public view, but not from the minds of those who were there. And decades later, when classified archives begin to open, new fragments will emerge. Fragments that suggest the story of the lost battalion of Bastogne was far from over. 2 decades after the guns fell silent, the Bastogne mystery should have faded into history. But it didn't. Instead, it began to re-emerge, slowly, uneasily, through declassified reports, veterans' testimonies, and the work of historians who refused to let the story rest. What they uncovered was not a single explanation, but a series of conflicting accounts that deepened the puzzle of what became of Captain McCulloch's men and raised questions about what may have been intentionally buried after the war. In 1961, the US Army's Historical Division quietly released a batch of declassified field reports from the Ardennes campaign. Among them were several German intelligence summaries captured in early 1945. One, filed by a Wehrmacht reconnaissance unit from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, described small-scale engagements east of Bastogne in January, weeks after Patton's forces had relieved the town. The report noted, Enemy infantry believed to be Americans, observed operating without armor or artillery support. Number unknown, appeared disorganized but maintained disciplined formations. The location matched the same forested ridge where McCulloch's platoon was last seen. At first, historians dismissed this as a clerical error, a case of misdated sightings during the chaotic German withdrawal. But the wording struck a chord with those who knew the story. The Wehrmacht report claimed the encounter occurred on January 8, 1945, 19 days after the patrol had vanished. By that time, there should have been no American forces east of Foy acting independently, and yet, multiple German field logs mentioned brief firefights with unknown Allied units throughout that week. Even more curious was a post-war debriefing conducted by US intelligence with former Wehrmachtmajor Karl Ludwig, who had commanded a reconnaissance company in the same sector. When asked about these encounters, Ludwig reportedly replied, "We thought we were fighting the same enemy over and over again. They came at night, fired from different positions, then disappeared before dawn. They wore American coats, spoke English, and carried M1 rifles, but they didn't behave like regular troops. No radio chatter, no wounded left behind." The transcripts were nearly forgotten until military historian Michael Turnbull revisited them for a 1974 documentary project. Turnbull described the case as an operational anomaly, a unit that seems to have existed beyond its own disappearance. He noted the precision of the German accounts, which repeatedly described the phantom Americans as well-equipped but silent, moving in small groups of 6 to 8 men. Too coordinated to be deserters, Turnbull wrote, and too few to represent a surviving battalion. At the same time, US archives revealed contradictory testimonies from American units operating near Bastogne during the same period. A reconnaissance troop from the 6th Armored Division recorded an engagement on January 10th with unidentified personnel wearing mixed Allied and enemy uniforms. They opened fire after warnings were ignored. The skirmish lasted only minutes. When the area was searched, no bodies were found, only empty shell casings and footprints leading into the trees. "We thought they were German saboteurs," the report reads, "but some of our own gear was found among their things." The similarity to earlier events was unmistakable. Once again, traces without bodies, movement without identification, Americans firing on Americans. But unlike the wartime chaos of December, these incidents occurred after Bastogne's relief, when front lines were stable and communication restored. Whatever was happening, it no longer fit the pattern of confusion. By the late 20th century, researchers began connecting these scattered reports. Some suggested that the missing men had joined up with isolated elements of other units, wildcat patrols operating outside official command. Others proposed darker explanations, that McCulloch's platoon had been caught in a friendly fire incident or mistaken for infiltrators during the siege. But none of these theories could explain the lack of remains, the repeated sightings, or the consistency of German and American testimonies describing similar encounters weeks apart. Declassified communications from SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, hint that higher command was aware of these irregular reports. A memorandum dated February 1945 mentions continued sightings of unverified US personnel operating east of Bastogne, believed to be remnants of cut-off units. The note ends curtly, "No further action necessary. Consolidate reports under category disbanded patrols." It was a bureaucratic full stop, one that effectively erased the story from military attention. For local Belgians, however, the story never vanished. In the decades that followed, villagers near Warden and Neff continued to tell tales of American soldiers seen wandering the forest roads long after the fighting had ended. Some even claimed to find old encampments disturbed, as if someone had been moving through them long after the war. Whether these were exaggerations, misremembered events, or genuine observations remains unknown, but the persistence of such accounts kept the legend alive. In modern times, a few independent researchers have returned to the Ardennes armed with metal detectors and wartime maps. Their findings are fragmentary: spent casings, ration tins, dog tags corroded beyond recognition. But the terrain still bears the same mystery. The forest remains eerily quiet. Even with GPS, the coordinates seem to shift, and visitors report the same sensation described by soldiers 80 years earlier: disorientation, the uncanny feeling of being watched. Every war leaves its share of unanswered questions. Lost patrols, missing convoys, names without graves. Yet the story of Bastogne's lost battalion continues to resist closure. The evidence is too scattered for certainty, yet too consistent for coincidence. Records on both sides of the front confirm their presence and their absence at the same time. In the words of Turnbull's 1974 report, if they were ghosts, they left bootprints. If they were men, they walked out of history and into myth. As the 20th century draws to a close, new technologies will allow for fresh searches, ground-penetrating radar, digital mapping, DNA recovery, and with them will come one final expedition into the Ardennes snowfields, seeking proof of what truly happened to the men who disappeared in the winter of 1944. The forests of the Ardennes stand quiet now. The trenches have softened, the foxholes filled with leaves, and the scars of war have long been absorbed by moss and soil. Yet beneath that calm lies one of the Second World War's most enduring mysteries, the fate of the lost battalion of Bastogne. More than 70 years after they vanished, their story continues to draw soldiers, historians, and investigators into the same cold silence where it all began. In the early 2000s, advances in ground-penetrating radar and forensic archaeology revived interest in the case. A joint team of Belgian and American researchers launched Operation White Echo, a survey of the woods east of Bastogne. Using declassified aerial photographs, they mapped old combat zones, aligning them with wartime reports and eyewitness accounts. The aim was simple: locate any trace of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment's missing men. The result was anything but. Near the old Foy Warden Road, scanners revealed faint anomalies beneath the soil, patterns resembling trenches and defensive positions. Excavation uncovered relics frozen in time. M1 rifle parts, American mess kits, a rusted canteen engraved Pavd R. Hollis, and a pocket Bible still legible after half a century. The personal effects matched names on McCulloch's roster. Yet, as before, no human remains were found. The earth had preserved their belongings, but not the men themselves. Archaeologist Dr. Anne Lenoir, who led the Belgian contingent, described the site as eerily intact. The positions were aligned west, consistent with earlier findings, as though the soldiers had expected an attack from their own lines. It's not uncommon for patrols to become disoriented, she noted, but what's striking is the order. Everything we found was deliberate. These weren't lost men. They were organized, waiting for something. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the US Army's Center of Military History reopened its files on wartime disappearances in Europe. The Bastogne case was highlighted as unresolved. The internal memo cited discrepancies in German and American records, overlapping sightings, and post-relief engagements of unidentified personnel. Forensic teams examined dog tags and artifacts from the Ardennes archives, hoping DNA might finally identify the missing. But degradation and incomplete records made testing inconclusive. None of the fragments recovered from the region matched the 327th's lost soldiers. For veterans who had fought there, the renewed search stirred old memories. "Those woods never gave them back," said Sergeant Edward Barnes, one of the last surviving members of the regiment. "You could feel something watching you when you went in there. Not ghosts, just history. It never stopped breathing." Barnes passed away in 2009, still carrying the silver lighter his captain had given him before McCulloch's patrol disappeared. As historians pieced together the evidence, a chilling timeline emerged. The patrol had left Bastogne on December 19, 1944. Within hours, all radio contact ceased. By December 22nd, their defensive positions were found facing west. German logs recorded firefights in that same area in early January. American records noted sightings of unverified US troops until mid-month. And then, nothing. No recovery, no remains, no closure. A disappearance stretching across weeks, overlapping confirmed battle lines, yet never resolved. For decades, explanations have ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary. Some believe the men were cut off, circled behind enemy lines, and succumbed to the cold. Others argue they were mistaken for German infiltrators and gunned down by their own side, the incident later buried to protect morale. A few suggest an unauthorized counter-patrol gone wrong. Men acting without orders, lost in confusion, their records intentionally erased. None of these theories fully align with the physical evidence. One of the final field reports from Operation White Echo captured the mystery best. The forest remembers movement, not death. Every artifact speaks of preparation, not defeat. It's a haunting phrase, fitting for a battle defined by endurance and uncertainty. Bastogne was a place where men were tested beyond human limits. And perhaps somewhere in that test, a line was crossed between duty and survival, between following orders and simply vanishing into the white. Today, the memorials in Bastogne stand as solemn witnesses to that winter. Visitors walk among the pine trees, reading plaques bearing the names of the fallen. The missing men of the 327th are honoured there too, their names etched alongside thousands of others. But their story feels different, unresolved, open-ended, almost whispering from beneath the snow. Locals say that on quiet mornings when the mist settles low, the woods still echo faintly with the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the crunch of boots in frozen leaves. What truly happened to Captain McCulloch and his men may never be known. Perhaps they were ambushed and buried by the snow, their final stand lost to time. Perhaps they wandered too far in a blizzard, their path swallowed by the storm. Or perhaps, as some soldiers quietly believed, they chose to keep moving, east, always east, refusing to surrender, fading into the white silence from which they never returned. In the end, the lost battalion of Bastogne became more than a wartime mystery. They became a symbol, not of death, but of disappearance, of how, in war, men can be consumed not only by violence but by history itself. Their story endures as a reminder that even the most documented battles leave spaces that defy explanation. The snow may have melted long ago, but the questions remain, cold, persistent, and waiting, in the forests where the soldiers of Bastogne disappeared into the snow.